In Select Series 3, Service Pack 2, or even Select Series 4 to be released at the end of 2014, one of the common questions that comes up is why do we still need the GPK file for the use with OpenRoads technology? The easiest way to explain this is by just a quick demonstration, in that a lot of the legacy applications that we're used to, for example, I have here the Plan View Labeler open. It still calls for selecting the GPK job number, just like we have in the past, and then the ability then to select a chain. So we have a lot of different applications in GeoPack that have not yet been migrated over to the new technology, and so therefore we need to utilize the GPK file for things like quantity calculations, utilizing Design and Computation Manager, for example, to label our profiles, our plot profiles for plans production. We also have, things like plans production, cutting plan and profile sheets, for example, or even particular applications like cross-section reports, etc. So the GPK file is still an integral part, but the workflow has changed in such that we would be designing our geometry in the plan view, and then that geometry would then get pushed back to the GPK as essentially a duplicate of what's working in the DGN file itself, which I'll explain in just a few minutes. So in essence, we need the GPK file to run some of our legacy applications, but the switch in the workflow is to not utilize the GPK file really for anything other than to point to chains for legacy applications. So to populate the GPK is where the workflow changes in Select Series 3 or Select Series 4. So let's answer this question. When do we want to pull information from a GPK, and when do we want to write information to a GPK? Typically, we want to use data in the GPK file, as mentioned previously, for legacy applications, or the other option is to import from a GPK geometry that was done in an earlier version of the GeoPack product. And so let's take a look at the import process. Essentially, under the OpenRoads technology general geometry, there is an icon here for importing of geometry. Now, one of the things to point out is we can import from a GPK, or if you are an OpenRoads user in GeoPack and create the ALG where you're importing graphics, you can actually import from an ALG. But the purpose of this video is specifically to look at importing from a GPK. So if I select the GPK file to import from, and I select Open, it's going to list everything in here of the GPK, for example, alignments, profiles, and it will be named such that the feature definition is assigned to that. And so if we take a look at that, I'm going to cancel here for just a minute, that particular GPK file. In Navigator, notice on the proposed profile we have assigned a feature called Geom Centerline, and on the alignment we also have a proposed feature called Geom Centerline. That feature lines up with the feature definition that is in our new Select Series 3 or Select Series 4 workspace. And so that spelling needs to exactly match our feature that we're going to assign that we import to. And if you don't have a feature on there, you can easily turn on redefine, as I've done here, and then select your chain, and you can then type in your feature. Right in Navigator, you can modify the name here, but just make sure that the name matches with the feature you want to give it when you import. So let's take a look at an import example. One of the things that you're going to notice is when you import horizontal geometry and or vertical geometry, you'll first have to pick the GPK file. In our case, example or 314 is our job number that has our real data that we want to import from. And then if we have a feature assigned to that geometry that we are importing, where that feature is set to auto annotate and auto export, and I'll get to that in a minute, then you'll be prompted then for a second GPK file where we want to store the information back to. In other words, the live information in the drawing. And that does tend to be a source of confusion. And so let me demonstrate what happens if I don't have that go to GPK file or the GPK file I want to write to. I want to show you what happens in that process. And so I'm going to go in and import from 314. And notice I don't have another GPK file in here. And I do not want to write back to this source GPK file, although I could. That is not a good idea. So we're going to select it, and let's go ahead and pull in this baseline in profile. So we selected that, and we'll say import. And now it's going to ask us to pick the job number we want to write back to. And so typically I would have like a blank job number, 001 or 999, that as this geometry is written to the file and a feature is assigned to it, then it becomes the live geometry in the DGN file and then linked back to the GPK file that is set up as auto export. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cancel this for just a minute because I want to explain what that actually means. And notice I have to hit cancel for every single part of that chain that it's trying to import. So it is kind of a little bit of a painstaking process to get through all the cancels. But when I do a fit view, I do have geometry here. But if I look at the feature definition, it is geom centerline, but there's no stationing on it because I didn't link that back to an active GPK file yet. So let's talk about this feature, this geom centerline feature, and what works with in terms of the auto annotation. So I'm going to go ahead and pin a couple of dialogues here, and I want to look at this feature definition geom centerline in the examples workspace. And the thing that I want to point out here are three things. One is the name prefix. Secondly, we have then the settings for the plan and the profile. The easiest thing I can do to explain this is we have this concept of auto annotate and auto export. If I were to draw something in the drawing using that particular linear feature assignment called geom centerline, it will show me stations and tick marks all along that geometry simply because I have it set to true for the auto annotate and the auto export back to the GPK file. What this does essentially is it looks at the MicroStation drawing scale, matches the MicroStation drawing scale to the scale in the Design and Computation Manager for that particular native style entry called geom centerline, and then it plots the station and tick marks based upon that match. And so if I look at Design and Computation Manager, I have in here the feature called geom centerline, and if I actually review that, you will see that I have, for example, stationing set up. And so here's my tick marks, and here's my station label. There's my station label, and you'll see I have all these scales in here. So if I were to set a drawing scale in MicroStation, because it does understand annotation scale, I would have to pick one of these scales, 20, 50, 100, 200, or 500. And then in the DDB file, I have to make sure that I have it set up based on a scale. And so you can do fixed height. And if you set these entries to fixed, then it won't be sensitive to annotation scale. But if you set it to what size is it basically based on a certain scale, and you have those entries in, then when you use the annotation scale in MicroStation, it'll understand taking that scale back to the DDB file. And so you can see the different scales that we support. There are a couple of restrictions here. You cannot just annotate without exporting, because the DDB file has to read the information from the GPK file, or it will not be able to annotate. And so that's what's going on underneath the hood, if you will. But you have to point back to the DDB entry, and that's why in our linear feature assignment we're set to native style for our plan view and also to auto export. Now on the profile, we don't necessarily need to go back to the DDB file, And so there's really not a reason to go back to the DDB file there because we cannot currently auto annotate the proposed profile. That's going to be coming in a future release. And so we have basically the auto export set for the profile, but the auto annotate option is not yet going to be available. We have this name prefix. Whenever we name horizontal geometry or our vertical profile, we still have to honor the GPK naming restrictions. For example, no spaces in names, no unusual characters, those types of things. And so be very careful on the feature definition name prefix. And we'll see kind of then how all this fits together here in a couple of examples. So just to kind of reiterate, we have a linear feature geometry here called Geom Centerline Examples Workspace, where we have auto annotate and auto export set to true. We're pointing back to the DDB entry that has all of our stations and tick marks and curve labels set up. And then we have auto export also turned on for the profile and utilizing an element template. And then our name prefix honors names that we can be supported in the GPK file. The last setting that you need in your environment for tick marks to work is under Design File, Civil Formatting. You need to make sure to change station settings on the equation to by index. By name is the default, and that's for inroads or also MX. But for GeoPack, it needs to be changed to by index. And so that default of by name needs to be changed in your seed files. So that's an important setting as well, or you won't get your stationing to show up correctly if that's not set accurately as well. So now that I've explained the linear feature concepts and the settings of the requirements of needing auto annotate and auto export turned on, pointing to the DDB entry and the scales in the DDB entries and how those are set up, let's go ahead and do some examples here and try to better explain how all of this fits together. What we're going to do is we're going to repeat the import process of that baseline, but this time we're going to have essentially a blank or a working GPK file ready to go. And so before I hit the import process, I'm going to cancel, and I'm just going to go to Kogo, and I'm going to put 999 in here for a job number and select OK to create that blank GPK file. And then we can close Kogo. And just notice that it doesn't really matter if I have redefine on or not. And just to show you, this is indeed a blank file. There's nothing in here right now. So let's go back to import again. We're going to repeat our process. And I'm going to pick my source GPK file first to import from. And in here, we're going to go down and again select our alignment and our proposed profile. So let's select import. And now we're actually picking the active GPK file that we want to write the information back to as we modify it. And this is where you do not want to pick your source file, but to pick your destination file or your active design GPK file. So we'll select OK, and then we'll allow that to finish its import. Now that that's completed, we'll come in and we'll just take a look at what we have here. And you can see now we have actual curve data, we have stations and tick marks, and this size, if you will, was dictated by our drawing scale. And so we come up to settings and we come to our drawing scale. It was essentially looked at terms of what is the scale of the drawing when it was imported, and it was set to 50. And so if we were to go back to the DDB file and look at Geom Centerline entry and look at the 50 scale, you would know that it has a size of 6, and that is the text size that we have here on our particular stationing. So what did it do for the profile? If we come into our profile view, so I'll select our geometry and we'll open the profile model, there's not going to be any labeling on this profile. The actual annotation of the profile is going to be included in a future release of the product. And so right now the profile model down here is simply for design purposes, but not for plans production. Whereas the auto annotation supported in the horizontal geometry will help us towards the goal of our plans production if desired. Now, how do I change this text size? Is it as simple as changing our drawing scale from 1 inch is 50 to 1 inch is 100? The answer to that is essentially yes and no. In other words, for it to understand to change the text, something has to happen to the geometry. Or in other words, it has to be modified or reprocessed to be able to pick up that new scale. And so one of the things that I have found, pretty easy little step to do, is I can just pick a curve and I can literally, change the radius of a curve and then change it back. And it's just a temporary workaround until we're no longer in that legacy environment. But just understand, if you do need to change the size of your text with your drawing scale, you can just make a quick change to your geometry, change it back, or even re-import it, whichever you want to do. But if you do re-import it, you need to delete what's in there first. Now, what exactly happened in our destination DDB or GPK file? If we go back to coordinate geometry and we look at this file 999, we should now have a chain called gray with the feature definition appropriately assigned, and you can see that that's there. And we also have a profile called proposed, and you can see that it comes in proper stationing and everything just as expected. And a couple of rules here on this profile is, if you do not give a proposed profile a name, here we'll go to the quick properties, that is acceptable to the GPK file, it will not import. And let me just give you a quick example. If I go in here and create another simple profile, I'll just do one here, line between points, and let's just say we have this profile created, and I come in and select it, and I can give that a name or not. If I don't give it a name, even with auto export turned on, it will not go back. But if I give it a name and then test, let's say for example, that then would be written back to the GPK file. And so if we go back to Kogo and we open up 999 again, back to our navigator, you will see now that we have this new profile called test, and it shows up just exactly like I plotted it down here. And notice that the redefine is not on, and so that redefine toggle is completely overwritten with the GPK file. Now, one of the questions that I hear a lot is, if I want to get rid of something, can I just delete it in the GPK file? And the answer is no, that's actually working now in reverse order. If you want to remove something, for example, this profile we just created, you simply go to the DGN and you delete it there, and then the GPK file itself will be updated, and then that profile will be dismissed. Now, that only works though if you have a feature assigned that has auto export and auto annotate turned on. And so just remember, if I'm using a feature that is not have those properties set to true, changing something in the DGN file will not affect the GPK. And that is something that some people prefer, that workflow. For example, they may choose to simply draw all their geometry with the linear feature they choose to. Let's say that I'm just going to pick geometry scratch here. And they'll come in and place some geometry out here. And so here's some geometry, and we'll put some more in there. And let's place an arc real quick. So there's some geometry there. And then we can come in and complex that. And at this point, then we can come in and change this feature definition at this point to geom centerline. And when we do that, that particular geometry will then be not only stationed based on the current active scale, but it'll also be written back to the GPK file. And so now if I go back to the GPK file and I go to Navigator, you will see in our chain that we have a new chain here called Route 66. So that's just another way that you can approach your workflow to get that auto annotation, is to do all of your geometry work in a feature that does not write back to the GPK file, but then when you're done, change the feature to something that does. So that is another alternative. And just a couple of things to point out. If I look at the element information on that geometry, you're going to see that it understands what GPK file it's supposed to go with. But let's say, for example, you want to place some geometry, but you want it to go to a different GPK file. And so if I come in here and I'm just going to do complex by elements, and I'm going to place some geometry here, it's going to prompt me. And let's say that I was going to 999, and so we'll let it write this geom.cl based alignment in there. And I'll right click finish. And so now if I come in here and I look at element information, you're going to see that it's written to 999. Well, some people think, well, if I come in and open 001, then that makes a new active GPK file that I can write to, right? And so if I come in here and I now open and place another one in here, so I'll place this one and I'll finish. And then if we take a look at that one, you can see it still wrote to 999 even though we opened Kogo and reset to 001. Well, basically once you come in and you pick your active GPK, that active GPK is going to stay active until you restart the product. So the best thing to do here is, at this point, just go to element information, select the entry, type in the GPK that you want it to be associated to, and then it will write this geom.cl2 baseline or chain to GPK instead of 001 now. And so if I come over back to Kogo and I go to here into 001, you will see I have these chains in here that I have been working with. Now, if I come back to this one, you're going to see that it's still assigned to 999. And if I come in here and modify it, it's going to still write back to 999 and update that one accordingly. So essentially, just because you open Kogo and pick a different GPK file does not mean it's going to get reassigned to that file. It's going to stay with the last active one that you were prompted to select. But you can at any time go back into there and make the change and have it go to a different GPK file, and that is acceptable. Just to show real quickly, what we don't do is we don't want to go into the GPK file now, and if we go to Navigator, for example, and select these chains and delete them, even if I turn on redefine here, let's say that I delete geom2, I'll go back in here one more time. So I got redefine on, Navigator, I select number 2 and I delete it. We'll say yes, and this was something else I was working on earlier, so we'll just go ahead and take it out. So I deleted those chains. Well, this geom.cl2 is still here, and so if I simply just move it, it's going to, or basically any type of geometry updating, I come back in there, because that's where that one was associated with, you're going to see it puts it right back in there. And so remember, the GPK file is now basically a byproduct of your plan view design, and so you don't want to make changes to any OpenRoads technology geometry in the GPK file. You do it graphically and then let it get written back. Now, one of the things some agencies are doing is they're not using a feature with auto annotate and auto export. They're instructing their users to simply just export to native, which is useful for utilizing a different workflow where you don't really have to be concerned about linkage to the GPK file. You just send something back when you're completely done working, and that does not have to have a feature that is set to auto export because you're manually exporting the particular entity here. And so essentially you just would follow the prompts, you locate the elements, you give it a name, and it writes it back to the GPK file. So that is an alternative workflow that is equally effective. Another question that we get a lot is, why in GeoPack if I draw a tangential alignment, basically a line between 2 points, why don't I get stationing? That's because you're actually sending a line back to the GPK file for auto annotation. And if you remember in Design and Computation Manager, you cannot put stations and tick marks on a line. You can only put them on a chain. And so essentially you need to make a chain between 2 points to get that auto annotation to work. And so what we did is we created a priority build for Power GeoPack in the GeoPack suite, if you will. And it's going to be 0811. Let me go back here and show you the version right here. 081109.723. The only thing that this priority build introduces is the ability to show stations and tick marks on essentially a chain made up of 2 points. But to get it to work, you cannot use the line between 2 points. You have to use this command, complex by PI. So you can see I have my active feature up here set, and we'll go to the complex by PI. And essentially we're just going to place 2 points. So I'll put in my first point, I'll put in my second point, and then I'll right click cancel. And then what that's going to do is give me my stations and tick marks, you can see, on that particular line between 2 points. The other thing here just to show is I can at any time change the beginning stationing. We have in here the command to set a start station. So we locate our element, and the distance from the start in this case would be 0. And let's say we wanted a different start station, we just put that in, and you will see that our station immediately updates. And that also gets updated then in the GPK file. And so if we look at the GPK file, we're going back to 001 now in this example. We come back to here, and you will look at the stationing. You'll see that that's going to line up with those changes that we made. And so you'll see here the start stationing now is 12. And so just remember, if you need to see stations and tick marks on a tangential alignment, you'll need to get that priority build. Just log a ticket with support and tell them you need priority build 723 of either Power GeoPack or GeoPack Suite, and that will have that fixed. Another question we get a lot is, how do I protect my alignment from not being modified once I'm done, so that someone who's not familiar with the OpenRoads technology will not make those changes inappropriately. So all you have to do is just select it and just use the MicroStation Lock command, if you will. And so that's underneath Edit and Lock. And then once that's locked, you're not going to get your handles to move it. I know it's such a simple concept, but when you think about it, that really is a pretty easy way to lock that geometry down, and it won't be modified. And just remember that if that is set to auto export, going back to that GPK file, and you change it, it will also update the GPK file. And so you either need to utilize a feature on your geometry design that doesn't automatically auto export, or you need to lock it down once you're done. Make sure that you do a good job with training your users and let them understand that geometry is live in the DGN file. The last thing I want to demonstrate is, how do I get the existing ground profile back to the GPK file for plans production? Let's say that I have a terrain model on my project, and I've made that terrain model active. And so here you can see we have an active terrain model. And I select my geometry, and I open that up in the profile model. And this was the geometry that we imported as an example earlier. And if I kind of move around here a little bit, you're going to see the existing ground show up in some places. And there's an example. And if I select that and take a look at its quick properties, it has an entirely different feature definition called existing boundary, which is set up for the way we display terrain models. And so it's not going to automatically auto export back to the GPK file. So even if I give it a name, because you can't export back to the GPK file without giving the profile a name. But let's say that I call it exist and I go back to, for example, the GPK file here. We'll pick where we're active now, 001, and I'm going to go look at that the drop-down list in Navigator profile. You'll see proposed is in there, which we expected, but we don't have the existing in there yet. And so to get the existing profile in there, that has utilized a feature that does not auto-export, which is usually the case for terrain displays. We simply come up to our task, and under General Geometry, we can select Export to Native. And then we select our profile. You'll see it here, Exist. And then just reset. And then it says, what GPK file do you want to put it into? We'll pick 001, and it writes that existing profile then back to the GPK file. And so now we go back to Navigator. In Profile, you will now see that we have this in our GPK file, and then we can use that then for plans production. And so you see it has a whole lot of PIs in there, but you understand how that works, and it'll send that back to that GPK file. And so hopefully you'll find this information helpful in terms of how we can get and take advantage of the GPK file in Select Series 3 and Select Series 4. Just keep in mind the most important thing is when you're importing geometry from a GPK file, make sure to not make that master GPK file you're importing from also the GPK file you write back to. Again, that's not a good practice. And if you want to write to more than one different GPK file, you can just restart GeoPack, or once you store something, you can select it and then change it to the new file. But I think the easiest way is just to restart so that it'll refresh what's in memory as the active GPK. Hopefully this helps and will give you some insight as to why we still need the GPK file, how it is integrated, and what would be some potential accurate and proper workflows. Thank you for your time.